Honestly, I don't know why we even allow senior NCOs and warrants at an officer's promotion party. It just lowers the tone, the words, slick with champagne and unearned arrogance, sliced through the cheerful din of the officers' club. The crowd laughed, a nervous, sycophantic titter from the junior officers, a knowing, weary silence from the senior ones. The target of the insult, a woman standing alone near the back of the room, offered no reaction. She did not flinch. Her expression did not change. Her gaze did not waver from the middle distance. She simply brought a glass of water to her lips with a hand that was as steady as granite, a silent, profound stillness that seemed to absorb the insult without a ripple. But when Commander Thorne, watching from the balcony, saw the almost imperceptible way she balanced her weight, the subtle, coiled readiness in her posture, a flicker of something ancient and dangerous sparked in his memory. He knew that stance. It was the calm before a storm of terrible, beautiful competence. If you believe that true respect is earned in silence and proven through action, type competence below. The newly minted Lieutenant Derek Vance, his collar still stiff with factory starch and his ego inflated to bursting, saw none of this. He saw only what his assumptions allowed him to see. A woman of indeterminate age, her face a roadmap of experience he couldn't read, wearing a uniform that lacked the familiar, comforting geometry of a second lieutenant's bar or a captain's double bars. Her rank, a single, dark block with silver markings, was an anomaly to him, a piece of data his prejudiced mind filed under unimportant technician. He saw her quietness not as confidence, but as weakness, her solitude not as preference, but as exclusion. He swaggered closer, his clique of fellow lieutenants trailing him like pilot fish, emboldened by his perceived dominance. I mean, seriously, he continued, his voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. What do you even do? Fix the comms? Calibrate the coffee machines? This is a celebration for the leaders, the decision-makers, not the support staff. He punctuated his statement with a condescending smirk, a caricature of authority learned from movies, not from mentorship. The woman, Chief Warrant Officer 5, Eva Rostova, finished her sip of water. She set the glass down on a nearby table with a soft, deliberate click that seemed, impossibly, to echo in the suddenly tense room. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, finally moved, meeting his. There was no anger in them, no fear, no indignation. There was nothing at all, a placid emptiness that was more unnerving than any threat. This absolute lack of reaction was a language Vance did not speak. It was the language of professionals who had faced things far more terrifying than the puffed-up chest of a boy in a new uniform. It was a silence that said, "You're not a threat. You're not a concern. You're not even on my radar." This profound indifference was the one thing his ego could not withstand. He felt a flush of rage, the hot blood of humiliation rising in his cheeks. He took a step forward, his hand beginning to lift, not to strike, but to dismiss, to make a gesture of condescending effrontery, a pat on the shoulder, or a finger jab toward her chest. It was a violation of space, a physical assertion of his perceived superiority, a final, public act of disrespect designed to put the help in her place. He wanted to see her flinch. He needed to see her react, to validate his own fragile sense of power. He wanted to break that infuriating, monolithic calm. But the hand never landed. It was stopped, not by a physical block, but by the shattering shriek of the base-wide emergency klaxon, a sound that ripped through the celebration and plunged the room into a cold, professional dread. The festive atmosphere of the officers' club evaporated in an instant, replaced by the chilling symphony of crisis. Red lights bathed the room in a hellish glow, strobing across the faces of the officers, which had transformed from smug celebration to stark alarm. The klaxon's cry was not a drill. It was the sound of something expensive and important breaking in a very violent way. Shouts erupted as people reached for phones, for radios, their training kicking in with varying degrees of efficiency. Lieutenant Vance, his attempted gesture of dominance forgotten, spun around, his face a mask of confusion and a desperate desire to look like he was in control. He began barking questions, his voice a half-octave too high, trying to assert an authority he did not possess. "What's the status? Somebody give me a report. What's happening?" He demanded of no one in particular, his words swallowed by the rising tide of controlled panic. Amidst the chaos, Eva Rostova remained an island of impossible serenity. The alarm seemed to be a signal meant only for her. While others scrambled, she moved with a disquieting and methodical grace. Her previous stillness had not been passivity. It had been a state of readiness, a low-power mode from which she could surge into action without the wasted energy of surprise. She turned her back on Vance and the chaos he represented, her focus already 1,000 yards away, locked onto the problem. A large monitor on the wall, which moments before had been displaying a celebratory slideshow, now showed a stream of telemetry from the base's flight control center. It was a waterfall of numbers and symbols, a language of altitude, velocity, and system failures that was gibberish to most. To Rostova, it was a story being told in real time, and it was a tragedy. She walked toward it, her steps measured and even, her path cutting through the frantic movements of the other officers like a ship through choppy water. The story on the screen was catastrophic. The X-7 Ghost Hawk, the base's most advanced, most expensive, and most secret reconnaissance drone, had suffered a complete control surface failure on its final approach. It was in pilot's terms a dead stick, a multi-million-dollar asset, loaded with a full tank of highly volatile jet fuel and carrying a classified intelligence package worth more than the aircraft itself, was now a ballistic object, a silent, unguided missile falling out of the sky. Its trajectory was a sickening red line, arcing directly toward the small town of Havenwood, nestled just beyond the base's perimeter fence. The flight control operators, their voices tinny and strained over the club's speakers, were cycling through useless emergency protocols. Their commands were met with silence. The drone was deaf to their pleas. It was falling, and it was going to kill people. Vance, seeing Rostova staring at the screen, saw another opportunity to belittle her. "Get out of the way, warrant officer," he snapped, trying to regain his footing. "This is officers' business. Let the real pilots handle it." His words were pathetic attempts to reassert a hierarchy that the emergency had rendered meaningless. Rostova didn't even grant him a glance. She had already processed the data, run the calculations in her head, and understood the fundamental flaw in the controller's response. They were trying to fly a broken plane. She knew they had to speak to the machine on a more fundamental level. Her preparation was a study in absolute focus, a silent refutation of the surrounding panic. While officers shouted into radios and staff aides ran in circles, creating the illusion of action, Rostova moved with the unhurried precision of a master craftsman laying out her tools. She arrived at a vacant communications console tucked into an alcove of the club, a station normally used for coordinating VIP visits. Her fingers, which had held the water glass with such delicate stillness, now danced across the keyboard, her movements fluid and economical. She wasn't typing words. She was inputting commands, navigating through layers of security protocols with an intimacy that suggested she had built the system herself. The air around her seemed to thicken, to become a bubble of pure, concentrated competence. The noise of the room, the shouts, the alarms, all of it faded into a distant hum. Inside this bubble, there was only the problem and the solution. Lieutenant Vance watched her, his initial arrogance now curdling into a sort of baffled contempt. "What in God's name is she doing?" he muttered to another lieutenant. "Trying to send it an email? Someone get her away from that console before she makes things worse." But no one moved to stop her. There was something in her posture, in the absolute certainty of her actions, that held them captive. It was the same authority they had failed to see minutes before, now made manifest not by rank or voice, but by pure, undeniable purpose. Rostova's voice, when it came, cut through the noise with the clarity of a surgeon's scalpel. She keyed the microphone connected to the flight control tower. "Tower, this is Rostova. Patch me into the Ghost Hawk's maintenance subsystem. I need a direct command line to the propulsion and ballast control." Her voice was a calm, level alto. It contained no panic, no pleading, no adrenaline. It was the voice of someone ordering a coffee, not the voice of someone trying to avert a disaster. In the tower, a hairy technician's voice crackled back. "Ma'am, that's a restricted channel for ground diagnostics only. The aircraft is not responsive to." Rostova interrupted, not with anger, but with finality. Override authorization 9 Sigma Tango 7. Do it now. There was a pause. The code was deep level, a digital skeleton key that only a handful of people on the planet should have possessed. The technician, without knowing who he was talking to, recognized the sound of absolute authority. The connection was made. On her screen, the gibberish of telemetry was replaced by lines of raw code. The drone's digital soul laid bare. Vance scoffed audibly. This is insane. She's a mechanic playing pilot. He was projecting his own ignorance, his own terror, onto her inexplicable calm. He needed her to fail, because if she succeeded, his entire worldview, built on the flimsy scaffolding of rank and protocol, would shatter. But she was not failing. Her fingers moved in a blur, a rhythmic, hypnotic dance. She was not trying to fly the drone. She was performing open-heart surgery on its brain. She was bypassing the fried circuits and the dead actuators, speaking directly to the machine's most primitive functions. She was telling it not how to fly, but how to fall. The climax was not a bang, but a whisper of code against the backdrop of impending doom. On the main screen, the red line of the Ghost Hawk's trajectory continued its inexorable downward plunge. To the untrained eye, nothing had changed. The drone was still falling, Havenwood was still in its path, and disaster was seconds away. The controllers in the tower had fallen silent, their efforts exhausted, now just helpless spectators to the inevitable. Lieutenant Vance had a smug, tragic look on his face, the look of a man who was about to be proven right at a terrible cost. I told you, he whispered to his companion. She did nothing, but Commander Thorne, still watching from the balcony, leaned forward. He saw it, a single pixel, a fractional deviation. The red line on the map hadn't stopped falling, but it had bent just a fraction of a degree to the east. It was impossible. A dead-stick aircraft does not change its ballistic trajectory. It follows the unpitying laws of physics. Yet this one had. Down on the floor, Rostova's face was illuminated by the green glow of the terminal. Her expression was one of intense concentration, like a chess grandmaster contemplating a board with 1,000 pieces. She wasn't fighting the drone's descent, she was using it. She was firing the tiny directional attitude thrusters, designed for minute adjustments in the stratosphere, in frantic, calculated bursts. She was shifting the fuel load between the wing tanks, subtly altering the aircraft's center of gravity. Each command was a breath, a heartbeat, a prayer whispered in the language of machines. She was turning the drone into a crude, unpowered glider, trading altitude for horizontal distance with a skill that bordered on sorcery. The red line bent again, more noticeably this time. A collective gasp went through the room. It was no longer aimed at the church steeple in the center of Havenwood. Now, it was aimed at the fields on the edge of town. Still too close. Rostova's fingers flew faster. She was in a delicate, desperate dance with gravity and momentum. One wrong command, 1 millisecond of miscalculation, and the drone would stall, tumble, and disintegrate. She had to keep its nose down just enough to maintain airspeed while pushing it sideways, foot by painful foot, across the map. The drone was now visibly streaking across the sky outside the club's panoramic windows, a dark shape against the evening clouds. The red line on the screen jumped, swayed, and then settled, pointing now at a wide, empty expanse of marshland on the far side of the base, the designated emergency crash zone. A miracle was unfolding in slow motion, written in lines of code by a quiet woman at a forgotten console. With a final sequence of commands, she dumped the remaining fuel, venting it into the cold upper atmosphere to minimize the fire risk. Then, she triggered the emergency landing gear, not to land, but to create drag, to spoil the last of the drone's airspeed just before impact. The Ghost Hawk pancaked into the marsh, not with the fiery explosion everyone had expected, but with a heavy, final thud. It was a hard landing, but it was a whole landing. The asset was down. It was intact. It was safe. A profound, deafening silence descended upon the officers' club. Every eye was on the screen, where the red line had terminated harmlessly inside the green circle of the crash zone. The only sound was the soft hum of the electronics and the frantic, relieved shouts now erupting from the tower comms. Lieutenant Vance stood frozen, his mouth agape, his face pale. The words he had spoken moments before, "She did nothing," hung in the air, a monument to his own spectacular ignorance. He stared at Rostova's back, no longer seeing a mere technician, but a figure of impossible, terrifying competence. Ow! He breathed, the word a small, broken thing in the vast, echoing silence. That's not possible. Into the stunned vacuum of the aftermath, a new presence moved. Commander Elias Thorne descended the stairs from the balcony, his footsteps the only sound in the cavernous room. He was not a man who moved quickly, but every step was laden with purpose and an authority that was absolute. The crowd of officers parted for him like the Red Sea, their gazes shifting from the screens to their commander, and then to the quiet woman who was now slowly, methodically logging out of the command terminal. Thorne's face was a mask of grim steel, but his eyes, when they found Eva Rostova, held a light of profound, almost reverent recognition. He did not stop to ask questions of the panicked junior officers. He did not look at the telemetry screen. He walked directly to Rostova, his path a straight, unwavering line. He stopped a respectful 3 feet from her, a distance that acknowledged both her personal space and her professional stature. For a moment, he simply looked at her, and in that look, a silent conversation passed between 2 seasoned professionals, a shared understanding of the razor's edge upon which they all lived and worked. Then, Thorne turned to his aide, a young captain who was hovering nearby, looking utterly bewildered. "Captain," Thorne's voice was low, but it carried the easy command of a man used to being obeyed without question. "Pull up the official service record for Chief Warrant Officer 5, Eva Rostova. Display it on the main screen. All of it. Unredacted." The captain blinked, shocked. "Sir, a CW5's full file. Parts of it will be classified well above." Thorne cut him off with a glare that could peel paint. "I'm aware, Captain." "Do it," the aide, chastened, scrambled to a laptop. A few keystrokes, a password entry that required Thorne's own retinal scan from a connected device, and the screen flickered. The celebratory slideshow was replaced by the stark, black and white text of a military personnel file. The room held its collective breath. The mystery of the quiet woman in the corner was about to be solved. And as the first lines of text appeared, a wave of shock and dawning comprehension rippled through the assembled officers. The document that unfolded was not the record of a simple mechanic or a support technician. It was the biography of a ghost, a legend whispered about in classified circles but never seen. It was the story of a master of a secret and dangerous craft, written in the dry, official language of the military, a language that, for all its lack of poetry, could tell the most epic of tales. Lieutenant Vance stared, his blood running cold, as the truth, inarguable and absolute, began to scroll down the screen before him, each line another nail in the coffin of his arrogance. The narrator's voice seemed to boom in the silent room, though it was only the text on the screen, each word landing with the percussive force of an artillery shell. Name, Rostova, Eva A. Rank, Chief Warrant Officer 5, CW5. The first line alone was enough to cause a stir. A CW5 was a unicorn, a creature of myth in the modern military. They were the keepers of institutional knowledge, the senior-most technical experts in their fields, appointed directly by the secretary of the military branch. To have one on the base was rare. To have one standing unnoticed in the corner of the O Club was unthinkable. Unit, Special Activities Directorate, Aviation Element, Classified. The name was innocuous, bureaucratic, but to the few in the room who knew, it was a thunderclap. The Directorate was a euphemism for one of the most secretive units in the entire armed forces, a black ops organization that dealt with assets and missions that officially did not exist. They were the people who flew the planes that weren't on any books, who fixed the engines that hadn't been invented yet. Official title: Senior Technical and Flight Operations Architect. The title was a mouthful, but its meaning was clear. She wasn't just a pilot. She wasn't just an engineer. She was both at a level that transcended normal definitions. She designed, built, and flew the future. The screen continued to scroll, a relentless catalog of impossible achievements. Flight hours, 12,451. The number was astronomical. Most career pilots retired with a third of that. A significant portion was marked combat, classified, and experimental airframe testing. This woman had spent more time in the cockpits of secret, unstable prototypes than most pilots spent in a simulator. Awards and decorations. The list was dizzying. A Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest award for valor. A Silver Star with 2 oak leaf clusters, signifying 3 separate acts of gallantry in action. A Legion of Merit. A Distinguished Flying Cross. It was the ribbon rack of a 4-star general, not a technician, special qualifications. This was the final, devastating blow to Lieutenant Vance's world. The list was long, a litany of skills that sounded like science fiction. Advanced Avionics Engineering. Asymmetric Warfare Systems Integration. And then, the last line, the one that made the entire room gasp as one. Lead Design Engineer and Chief Test Pilot. Project Ghost Hawk X-7 program. She hadn't just saved the drone. She had created it. The override code she had used wasn't something she had looked up. It was a backdoor she had written into the very source code herself. The maintenance subsystem was her personal workshop. She knew the machine not as a pilot knows a plane, but as a god knows its creation. The screen went blank. The silence that followed was heavier, more profound than before. It was the silence of awe. Commander Thorne let the moment hang in the air, allowing the full weight of the revelation to settle on the room, most especially on the pale, trembling lieutenant. Then, with a precision that mirrored Rostova's own, Thorne turned to face her. He drew himself up to his full height, his back ramrod straight. He executed a salute, not the casual gesture between officers, but the slow, formal, blade-straight salute of ultimate respect, a gesture reserved for the Medal of Honor or a fallen hero. Ma'am, his voice was iron, ringing with a respect that was absolute and unconditional. The word, ma'am, from a full commander to a worn officer, was a deliberate and powerful statement. It transcended the neat lines of the rank chart and acknowledged a different, higher form of authority, the authority of pure, undeniable competence. On behalf of this entire installation, thank you. You saved lives tonight. He then lowered his hand and turned his gaze upon the assembled officers, his eyes like chips of ice. His focus landed on Lieutenant Derek Vance, and he did not look away. For those of you who require clarification, Thorne's voice dropped, becoming dangerously quiet. That rank on her collar, the one some of you seem to find so confusing, represents a sacred trust. It represents a lifetime of knowledge that cannot be taught in a classroom or an academy. It represents a legacy of service that you, Lieutenant, he pointed a single, steady finger at Vance, had the unmitigated arrogance to disrespect. You did not just insult an officer. You insulted an institution. You mistook a living legend for a janitor because you were too blind, too ignorant, and too enamored with the sound of your own voice to see what was standing right in front of you. Let this be a lesson for every one of you. The true measure of a soldier is not the shape of the medal on their collar. It is the caliber of their character and the depth of their competence. A lesson which, tonight, was taught to all of us by Chief Rostova. The story of that night spread not like wildfire, but like the slow, inexorable rising of the tide. It didn't burn out quickly. It seeped into the very foundations of the base's culture, changing the landscape forever. It wasn't told as a piece of juicy gossip, but as a parable, a teaching moment recounted in hushed, reverent tones in every corner of the installation. In the hangars, grizzled master sergeants would tell it to young airmen while stripping down a turbine, using it as a lesson on why you always listen to the quiet ones. In the barracks, squad leaders would tell it to new recruits as a cautionary tale about the dangers of assumption. In the officers' clubs of other bases, it was passed between pilots and commanders as a modern military fable, a testament to the quiet professionalism that formed the true backbone of the service. The name Rostova became a legend, a symbol of the immense, hidden power that lay dormant within the ranks, visible only to those with the wisdom to see it. And the phrase, "don't pull a Vance," entered the base's lexicon, a sharp, immediate shorthand for an act of profound, arrogant ignorance. For Lieutenant Vance, the aftermath was a crucible. Commander Thorne, in his wisdom, knew that a formal punishment would be less instructive than a public reckoning with his own failure. Vance was not demoted or confined to quarters. Instead, he was forced to exist in the world he had created. He had to walk past the very worn officers and senior NCOs he had held in such contempt, and their faces, not angry, not accusatory, but simply knowing, were a far more potent punishment than any stockade. Their silence judged him more harshly than any court-martial. His clique of sycophants abandoned him, not wanting to be tainted by his disgrace. He was an island, isolated by the sheer gravity of his mistake. The humbling was slow, painful, and utterly transformative. It began with an apology. Thorne made him write it by hand, 1,000 words detailing his ignorance and disrespect. Then, at the next base-wide formation, in front of thousands of assembled personnel, Lieutenant Vance was made to stand at a podium and read it aloud. His voice, once so full of bluster, was now a quiet, trembling thing, stripped bare of all its false confidence. He apologized not just to Chief Rostova, who was not present, but to the entire warrant officer and non-commissioned officer corps. He admitted his arrogance, his prejudice, his complete and total failure as a leader and an officer. It was a brutal, agonizing act of public contrition, and it was the beginning of his salvation. He started to learn. He was seen in the motor pool, not shouting orders, but asking a master gunnery sergeant how to diagnose a transmission leak. He was seen in the comms shop, listening intently as a warrant officer explained the intricacies of a satellite uplink. He was learning to close his mouth and open his ears. He was discovering that the knowledge he needed to be a true leader wasn't found in textbooks, but in the calloused hands and quiet wisdom of the people he had once dismissed. His journey was just beginning, but for the first time, he was on the right path. While Vance began his long road to redemption, Eva Rostova simply went back to work, as unaffected by the praise as she had been by the insults. The adulation that followed the incident was, to her, just as irrelevant as the lieutenant's scorn. It was noise, and she was a professional who operated in the signal. When a group of young, hero-worshipping pilots found her in a hangar the next day, standing before the now-recovered Ghost Hawk drone, they showered her with praise, calling her a hero, a legend. She looked up from the damaged fuselage, her hands covered in hydraulic fluid, and her expression was one of mild confusion. "I'm not a hero," she said, her voice calm and direct. "I was doing my job." The drone performed as designed under emergency conditions. The system worked. She then turned back to her work, pointing out a hairline fracture in a support strut to a young airman, her focus already back on the problem, on the details. To her, the applause was a distraction from the real work, learning from the failure, improving the design, and ensuring it never happened again. Her humility was not a performance. It was a natural state of a person whose confidence was so deeply rooted in her own ability that it required no external validation whatsoever. She found more satisfaction in teaching a young mechanic how to properly torque a bolt than in receiving a medal from a general. Her legacy was not something she cared to cultivate. It was something she lived every day in the quiet, methodical pursuit of excellence. But a legend has a life of its own, independent of its subject. The spot in a marshland where the drone had landed was unofficially christened Rostova's Point. Pilots flying over it would dip their wings in a small, silent gesture of respect. A new culture began to take root on the base, a culture of mutual respect that transcended the traditional boundaries of rank. Junior officers began to actively seek the counsel of their senior NCOs, understanding that their own survival and the success of their missions depended on the deep wells of experience those senior leaders possessed. The incident became a catalyst for positive change, a story that realigned the base's moral compass. The most powerful artifact of the event was something no one would ever see. The flight data recorder was analyzed at the highest levels of the Pentagon. The few seconds of code Rostova had improvised in the O Club were isolated and studied with a kind of religious awe. It was a brilliant, elegant, and brutally efficient solution to a catastrophic problem, something that teams of engineers had theorized about but had never been able to implement. It was a perfect fusion of human intuition and machine logic. They gave it a name. It was now officially designated the Rostova Maneuver, an emergency protocol that was subsequently programmed into every advanced drone and aircraft in the fleet. Her quiet, desperate act in a moment of crisis had just become a permanent part of aviation history, a silent, invisible piece of her competence that would go on to save countless other lives and assets for generations to come, a legacy written not in bronze or stone, but in the silent language of code. A year passed, and the seasons turned. The story of the night at the O Club was no longer a fresh event, but had hardened into institutional folklore, a foundational myth for the new arrivals at the base. Commander Thorne had made it so. It was now a mandatory part of the in-processing brief for all newly commissioned officers. They were sat down in a classroom and told the story, not as a piece of gossip, but as a core lesson in leadership. They were shown the personnel file of CW5 Rostova, and then they were shown the public apology of Lieutenant Vance. The message was clear and uncompromising. Here, respect is not a function of your rank, but of your character. Here, you will listen to your NCOs. Here, you will honor the knowledge of your warrant officers. Here, you will not make the same mistake. The culture of the base had genuinely shifted. The us versus them mentality that can sometimes fester between officers and enlisted personnel had been replaced by a powerful sense of symbiosis. The Officers Club was no longer just for officers. On Friday nights, it was common to see a young lieutenant sharing a table with a grizzled first sergeant, the two of them sketching out a plan on a napkin, equals in their shared commitment to the mission. The change was real, it was tangible, and it had all started with one woman's unshakable calm in the face of one man's foolish pride. Lieutenant Vance, now a first lieutenant, was a different man. The arrogance had been burned out of him, replaced by a quiet, thoughtful humility. He was known for being one of the best young officers on the base, not because he was the smartest or the most aggressive, but because he was the best listener. He treated every soldier, from the lowest private to the highest-ranking NCO, with a deep and abiding respect. He had learned, in the most public and painful way possible, that true strength was not in giving orders, but in earning the trust of those you lead. He never spoke of that night, but the lesson was etched into every action he took. He was on a path to becoming a fine leader, a path forged in the fires of his own public humiliation and redemption. CW5 Eva Rostova was, of course, long gone. Her kind of expertise was a national asset, moved from one critical problem to the next like a queen on a global chessboard. No one knew where she had been assigned, and no one asked. But her presence remained a ghostly, guiding influence on the base. Her name was a benchmark for professionalism. Her story was a reminder that the most powerful weapon in any arsenal is a quiet, competent mind. Her legacy was not in the drone she had saved or the protocol that bore her name. It was in the hundreds of better officers and leaders her actions had inspired. It was in the thousands of small moments of respect that now occurred daily between ranks, a ripple effect of her silent, powerful example. True authority, the story teaches us, is not granted by commission or signified by the insignia sewn onto a uniform. It is not found in the volume of a voice or the swagger in a step. It is a force of nature, like gravity, that reveals itself in moments of extreme pressure. It is the calm hand that steadies the ship in a storm, the quiet voice that cuts through the panic with a clear solution. It is earned in the lonely hours of study, in the grease under the fingernails, in the endless repetition of a difficult craft until it becomes an extension of the soul. It is the quiet competence that needs no introduction and seeks no applause. Lieutenant Vance's mistake was to believe that the map of rank was the territory of worth. He saw the world through the simplistic lens of a flowchart, unable to comprehend the complex, unwritten hierarchies of skill, experience, and wisdom. Eva Rostova lived in that territory. Her entire existence was a testament to the fact that what you are is infinitely more important than what you are called. She was a master, and the masters of any craft have their own authority, one that transcends the petty structures of ordinary life. Her silence in the face of his insults was not passivity. It was a conscious refusal to participate in his shallow reality. She would not dignify his ignorance with a response. She would not be dragged down to his level. She would wait, and she would allow her actions to speak for her. And when they spoke, they did so with the force of a thunderclap, rearranging the reality of everyone who witnessed them. The legacy she left behind was not a statue or a plaque, but a change in the very air of the base. It was a new understanding that respect is a currency that must be earned every single day through humility and hard work. It is the understanding that the person with the quietest voice in a room is often the one you should be listening to the most intently. True strength does not need to announce itself. It is proven, not proclaimed. It is demonstrated in the crucible of a crisis, and its light is all the brighter for having been hidden. This is the enduring lesson of the quiet professional. Your character is your credential, and your competence is your true rank. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud assumption, and where silent professionalism defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.